Good evening, everyone. It's good to see everyone out this evening. We're going to sing number 501, "O Worship the King," and then Dan will be teaching to us out here in the auditorium class tonight as we continue our study on worship. 501. Oh, worship the King, all glorious above, and gratefully sing his wonderful love. A shield and defender, the ancient of days, pavilion in splendor and girded with praise. Thy bountiful care, what tongue can recite? It breathes in the air, it shines in the light. It streams from the hills, it descends to the plain, and sweetly distills in the dew and the rain. Frail children of dust and feeble as frail, in thee do we trust, nor find thee to fail. Thy mercies how tender, how firm to the end, our Maker, Defender, Redeemer, and Friend.
Well, good evening. I have to admit, Paul and I were discussing, Paul and I put this here, and James, you and I were discussing it, and Lynn, whether I was on the wrong side for teaching. I have to have something to put my stuff on so I can refer to notes. So I'll try to talk loud enough with the microphone that you can hear me over there. Let me get this turned on. All right, well, welcome back. Those of you who were here last week, you know last week we got a head start on this subject in this class. So there's been a bit of a preview, if you will, for those who were here last week. But some of you may just be starting tonight, since the new quarter actually just starts tonight. So I thought I would begin by a real quick review of the basic topics and some sources we are using for the class. The purpose, the source actually, let me show you the book. It's More Than a Feeling, Worship That Pleases God by Jimmy Jividan is one of the main outlines, I guess you would say, we're using for a structure of our discussion. Of course, I consider the text of our class the Bible. Jimmy Jividan is just helping us maybe put it in sequence, topical sequence, but we're here to study the Bible. The purpose is to affirm the New Testament practice of worship. We're not here to try to invent something new, but we're here to recognize that maybe things could be made better. But we shouldn't change things or advocate for change just because, well, we ought to change something. But we want to look at what the Bible says about worship, how we worship, how we should worship, and we want to worship in a way that pleases God. So that's our objective, is to examine the New Testament practice of worship. The three sections in his book, first of all, the nature of worship, and that's what we are continuing for the first few weeks. Then we will look at worship practice, things like prayer and singing and so forth. And we will look at details on those various parts of worship and how we conduct them or practice them, and explore ways that we could make it better. And that might be just right here in our own mind largely. So I'm not saying, hey, we need to change this, but we need to worship better. I told the group last week that I first used this text, this study guide, probably 2 decades ago, more or less. And I have to admit, I learned a lot about worship by the study that I just maybe took for granted before or had not realized before. And I believe there's still room to grow, but I believe I worship better after a study like this than I did before. I understood it better. I appreciated it more in many ways. We will explore that, especially when we get to worship practice in that section. And then finally, the last couple of class sessions, we will look at some brotherhood tensions, different opinions and problems that when people try to change things that maybe shouldn't be changed, that can cause some grief. So we will try to look at that at the end of the series. Randy and I are sharing the class, so I think, Lord willing, he's got next week. And we'll take, it's not going to be, I take a week, he takes a week. We'll split it up in various ways, but that's our plan, at least for the time being. We mainly discussed last week why we worship, and we summarized it in these 4 areas. 1, it's natural. We are made this way. We are made to worship. And we looked at Acts chapter 17, Paul's sermon on Mars Hill, as an evidence of that. And just specifically that those folks in that place, they didn't want to leave out anybody that should be worshiped, so they wanted to worship the unknown God. And that's how we discussed that. And remember how, I guess, would artful be a way to describe Paul's dealing with that? Said, you're worshiping something you don't know. I'm here to tell you about that. And very powerful. Another reason we worship, it's dangerous to neglect it. A lot of folks take it for granted, don't appreciate it, perhaps don't see its significance or its importance. But it is dangerous if we neglect it. And we looked at Romans chapter 1 briefly to see some examples or some of the dangers involved in neglecting it. Essentially, if we neglect genuine, true worship, we can see in Romans 1 that we may just end up with that depraved mind and we begin worshiping things we should not worship. And we could reach a point where God's truth doesn't touch our hearts. And we just go do things our own way. And that's dangerous, as Paul teaches in Romans 1. And thirdly, Jesus commanded it in Matthew chapter 4:10 when he was dealing with the temptations of Satan. Remember, there was the temptation to worship, for Jesus to worship Satan. And what did Jesus say? I bet y'all can quote that Matthew 4:10 pretty closely.
Get thee behind me.
Well, he said, get behind me, but in another place, but right here, worship the Lord your God. You're thinking of John, well, that's another one. It is written, you shall worship the Lord thy God and...
With all your heart, with all your soul.
Well, that's the other one. That's where I was thinking he was going. But, and him only shall you serve. All right? So, God, or Jesus tells us to worship. And he was quoting the Old Testament and saying that. Worship God only, and him only you will serve. We'll look at that passage again before we finish tonight. But we want to turn our attention to what it means to worship tonight, the 2nd chapter in Jividen's book. In Luke 11:1, the disciples asked Jesus a question. Lord, teach us to pray. Why do you suppose they asked that? They didn't want to mess it up. Good. Good. But that would be a good reason for us to explore this subject, wouldn't it? We want to learn to worship, so let's study worship. All right? Anything else? They saw Jesus do it, didn't they? They understood Jesus was a man of prayer. And, well, they wanted to follow him. Have you ever had anybody ask you how to pray? I think the first time I remember that happening was a friend of mine in high school, and we were talking about such things, and he never had any experience with prayer. I don't even know, how do you do that? And I'm going, say what? But Jesus had an opportunity because he had people that wanted to know how to pray. And prayer is part of worship. So it's, I think, entirely appropriate that we study this. They wanted to learn how to worship in prayer. So we can see then that worship is something that you do, right? It's something that you do. Worship has been described as worth-ship. Perhaps you've heard that play on words, if you will, as part of a definition. A typical dictionary definition you see on the screen: the act of paying divine honor to God, a feeling of respect or reverence for power, position, merit, virtue, etc. We could worship, maybe not properly, but people could worship someone just because of who they are. But great honor and respect, pay great honor and respect to. And I didn't write down which dictionary this came from because I really don't care. We are not here to study how Merriam-Webster or somebody like that, some books like that, tell us how to worship. We want to study how the New Testament tells us to worship. To understand what it means to worship as God desires, that's where we need to go, not to a human written dictionary. So that's going to be our focus. We want to understand the terms used for worship in the Bible. How does the Bible describe worship? That's where we're going to get the answers to these kinds of questions. Just as surely as they asked Jesus to teach them to pray, let's let the Bible teach us to worship. I'm not a student of Greek. Paul, you'll have to bail me out on even pronunciations here. Paul's studied this way far more than I have ever even attempted to. But from this source, he's outlined or detailed that 10 Greek terms are used, 10 different Greek terms are translated worship in the English New Testament. Some of those are only used once. Some convey the idea to venerate, which is very similar to that dictionary definition, if you will. Go look venerate up for that. You have to define a term with a defined term, don't you? Another one appears 5 times and refers to spiritual service, of sending benevolent contributions, or participating in preaching and teaching ministries. So there are a great number of uses of the word or occurrences of the word, but we're going to look at 2. The 2 most commonly used or occasions in the New Testament of worship in our English Bible and what the words were used for them. So here you go. Help me, Paul. Proskuneo? Okay. Proskuneo. It occurs 59 times in the New Testament. That's a pretty significant number. So let's make sure we understand what that means. It focuses on the attitude. And in fact, for a little, not homework, a little interactive thing here in a minute. How about, you can all look up both passages, but at least I want this half to look up Matthew 28:9, and that half to look up Acts 10:25. Now, if you both want to look it up, that's fine too. I don't mind if everybody participates in both, but at least we will have some to answer a question for me in just a moment. But proskuneo, occurring 59 times in the New Testament, focuses on the attitude. It's described as the custom of prostrating oneself before a person and kissing his feet, or the hem of his garment, or kissing the ground. One source compares it. Any animal lovers in here? Any of you have animals that you love? Now, some people might have animals you don't love, but several of you do. I bet you don't mind it when that dog comes and licks on you. That just grosses me out. But y'all, you who love animals, you probably just really like that. That's an expression of their love. One source describes this proskuneo as like a dog licking his master's hand. I mean, to your dog, if you have a good relationship with your dog, you are it. Am I right? Some of you who have that kind of relationship, and that dog, buddy, it's just about like your little kids. You know, they think you walked on water, don't they? Now they grow up and they learn better, but your dog never gets out of that. Your dog just, I mean, you can even talk mean to it, and I bet it'll still come and lick your hand. It loves you that much. So some folks would describe, or have described, proskuneo like that, just that attitude. All right, so slow down. Matthew 28:9. Someone, if you care to read that good and loud from over here, and then I'll ask a question. And I'll ask the question first, while it's being read. What about worship do we see in its use here? All right. If someone wants to read that, please. Don't all speak at once.
And as they went to tell the disciples, behold, Jesus met them, saying, Rejoice. So they came and held him by the feet and worshiped him.
All right. Now that's occurring after his resurrection. You remember the women at the tomb? They thought, where is he? He's taken. Then they saw him. So what aspect of worship, what did they do to worship him? And this is an easy question. They fell down and kissed or held his feet, right? That's an expression of an attitude, isn't it? They didn't see themselves as higher than him, did they? They saw the relationship for what it was. He was far superior. They were humbled, if you will, at that. All right? Now for this other side, Acts 10:25. Same question, but a different passage and a different situation. If someone would read that loudly and clearly.
As Peter was coming in, Cornelius met him and fell down at his feet to worship him.
Okay. We don't have time to go into all of the background of that, but why did Peter, just a real brief recap, why did Peter go to see Cornelius?
Directed by the Spirit.
All right, you remember the vision, the sheet, and all of that, and so he went because Cornelius had been praying, and Cornelius was told, send somebody for Peter down at Joppa. Peter has this vision, and then all of that materializes that Peter shows up back to see Cornelius. Well, that would be pretty impressive, wouldn't it? If you were Cornelius and you had this all laid out for you, you'd probably think pretty highly of Peter, wouldn't you? So what does it say Cornelius did as far as his relationship with Peter? He fell down at his feet and worshiped him. That's not what he was supposed to do, was it? Because what did Jesus say in Matthew 4? Worship God, right? But you can see the use of the term worship, that expression of attitude. Okay, let's go a little further. The next word is latruo. Hey, all right. I get at least a B- in Greek class tonight. All right. This is used 18 times, and it focuses more on the act itself, what is actually being done, as opposed to the attitude. It's not separated from the attitude, really, but it focuses on the act. It means to serve or carry out religious duties, to minister to, or sacrificial service. A couple of references there. Same thing. How about this side takes Luke 2 reference, and that side takes Hebrews 12. And again, we want to see what evidence of worship, or what we can learn about worship, how is it demonstrated in these two verses. And this is latruo, all right? Luke 2:37.
And she was a widow of about 40 years, which departed not from the temple, but served God and
Okay. So she served God with fasting and prayer. So she was doing something, the fastings and the prayer. I was supposed to let y'all answer that, and here I just rattled it off. But there you go. Her actions of fasting and prayers were demonstrations of her worship to God. Okay, I'll try to do better on this side. Hebrews 12:28.
Wherefore we receiving a kingdom which cannot be moved, let us have grace whereby we may serve God acceptably with reverence and godly fear.
Okay, so the idea in the word is serve God there, is this latruo with reverence and fear. But to serve, to do something, the act itself. Well, here's a good question. Well, maybe it's not a good question, but here's a question. Which is most important? Neither. Good answer. There you go. Might not have been a good question, but that was a good answer. They are both important. Like Kip referred to today on the two sides of the quarter. It's the whole package. Let me share Jimmy Jividen's statement about wrapping this up. Worship, on the one hand, involves the inner attitude of the worshiper, proskuneo. And on the other hand, the external acts he does in worship, latruo. Genuine worship, as the New Testament teaches it to be, is inner and outer. You take one of those without the other, Jesus very likely would describe that as empty or vain worship. Jesus used both of these terms. Well, first of all, they must not be separated. They go together. It's not genuine if you pull them apart. Jesus used both in his response to Satan at the temptation. We talked about that verse just a moment ago. You shall worship proskuneo, the Lord your God. You better have that right attitude. And serve latruo, him only. Do what he tells you to do. Inner attitude, proskuneo. Outward service or action, latruo. The worship Jesus describes, the worship the New Testament would teach us to practice, is both inner and outer. Both are critical. Proskuneo describes an attitude which excludes word-only worship. Latruo excludes the perversion of unauthorized acts of worship. Can you see the importance of both? If I were to come up with some new thing to do and say, well, this is how we should worship God. Well, if the Bible didn't specify we should do that, and I'm introducing something new, you ought to be very suspect. Because am I really serving him only? Am I really doing what he wants me to do? Or am I doing something to just please me? You see, can you see the importance of that? I want to share a little bit with you, one right now and another one later tonight. I showed you this book also, and I'll use this occasionally. Thou shalt worship the Lord thy God. This is an old book. Not as old as the Bible, but it's an old book by Andy Ritchie, Jr. And I've got a page number I wanted to refer to. That's something I introduced last week, but he said it so much better than I could ever think about it. So let me find it again. Here we go. You remember I talked about just the way we use words, and we might use them carelessly or recklessly, not with bad intent, but we might just not be as clear as we really should be, or as would be beneficial. Believing the worship of God to be a matter of simplicity, and in some respects this is not to be denied, we have often tragically mistaken the outward form and acts for the thing itself. Now let that sink in for a minute. Might we be guilty of that sometime? Going through the acts of worship and thinking we have worship. I really wish I had a picture. I vividly see in my memory bank a young man where he used to, well, I was getting ready to say he used to worship with us, but because of what I'm about to say, you might say, well, you didn't use that term right. He was there. I've had students in my college classes before that were there but weren't there. Bless you. I kind of think they were taking up astronomy. I don't know. They were outer space. They just weren't there. This particular teenager, his daddy was a song leader. And his mommy and daddy were just as good as gold. The only thing that turned this boy's excitement level up was bull riding. Now, he had some excitement about that. But anything that took place in that church building when we knew them was of no interest to that young man. Not a bit. He was there. But a good illustration of what it looked like if you were observing him was more like he was not asleep. I wish I had taken a picture, but that would be invading privacy, wouldn't it? But you've probably seen situations like that. He was physically there, but he was not there mentally, spiritually. In a Bible class, you couldn't get anything out of him unless you mentioned bull riding. He was more than willing to talk about bull riding. Maybe he bumped his head. Anyway, I'll continue with Brother Richie. Going to church, he puts it in quotes, going to church does not mean that the one who has gone has worshiped at all. If we said going to worship rather than going to church, we would be more accurate in the use of words, which I referred to last week. And yet, now here's an old-fashioned way of talking. We just don't talk this way anymore. It's artful, but it's just, we don't talk this way. And yet, the terminology improved would not mean the practice corrected. Just saying you're doing it differently. If we all just quit saying, well, going to church and started saying going to worship, that wouldn't mean we've gone to worship at all. The terms themselves don't cut it. Engaging in the so-called acts of worship, which are authorized by Scripture, and keeping out unauthorized does not constitute worship either. Let that sink in. We could do the 5 acts that we talked about last week, couldn't we? We could pray. We could drink the cup, eat the bread. We could listen to a sermon. We could engage in those acts and not worship at all, unless the acts are engaged in thoughtfully and meaningfully. Well, that's enough of that quote right now. You can't take one of these without the other and be genuine worship. Proskuneo, the attitude. Latruo, the act. Both unite together. All right, let's go a little further. Any thoughts or comments? Yes?
Do you have a slide on John 4:24?
Let me see. Well, I just went to read. There you go. That's just the Richie quote. I forgot to advance. But now look at this one. There you go. I even have in my, good for you. You remind me of another fella. A fella. And this is a good reminder. When I was in my mid-20s, pardon me? Uh-oh. I missed something. Oh, yeah. When I was in my mid-20s, we found ourselves in this little congregation in Illinois with a preacher that was in his mid-60s. He retired, moved away, but came back frequently to visit. I had the distinction of being given a book to teach a class, kind of like this, in this little congregation. And I had my notes. I said, I got to have something to refer to. I had all this laid out, had my notes all prepared. I start making a point, and on the day that this preacher is visiting, I'm thinking, man, you need to be up here. I need to be back there. So I made a point. He said, well, you know, Dan, John 4:24 says this. Oh, yeah, it does. And then I made another point or two, and he'd say, well, don't forget this. And I'd look and go, well, he just took that next thing out of my lesson, too. Your years of experience are wonderful. I'm so glad you brought that up.
You brought it up.
Well, but you mentioned it, and that shows you're thinking about this topic and you're tying it together. This,
Because only two passages that I'm aware put the act and the attitude together in John 4:24 and
good,
Matthew 4:10.
good.
The act and the attitude together.
Excellent, excellent. That preacher, he knew his stuff. And I thought, man, he had my lesson. I'd spent a good bit of time having that all laid out, and he just had it right here. I complimented him on that afterwards, and he says, well, when you've been doing it for 40 years, it comes a little more naturally. Yeah.
Just consider this a blind squirrel finding an acre moment.
Okay, a blind squirrel finding an acorn. Okay. All right, let's read this together. I might be able to read that well. The woman said to him, this is the woman at the well, you remember. The woman said to him, Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, and you Jews say that in Jerusalem is the place where one ought to worship. Jesus said to her, Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews. But the hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. Now, this is part of a lengthy encounter, and many, many wonderful lessons we could get from that encounter. But let's focus on these highlights. Christian worship is not confined to a physical place. Jesus said, neither in this mountain nor in Jerusalem. The place is not what is so critical. I think this is pretty important. The Father desires worship from his people. You see that? The Father is seeking such to worship him. We're looking for a deeper understanding of worship that pleases the Father. That's what we need to be focused on. That's what he is looking for from his people. Worship that pleases him. If that's our focus, then that guides what we do. If our focus is pleasing us, we might well be led astray. But the Father is seeking people that will worship him properly. And it makes a difference whether we follow God's directions in worship. He said, you worship that which you do not know. Paul kind of addressed that at Mars Hill, didn't he? They were worshiping, but it was in ignorance, and it was not even the right thing to worship. They were worshiping all of these false gods. Those who worship God in a way that pleases God, Jesus himself said they must worship how? In spirit and in truth. In spirit and in truth. So let's explore that just a bit. Some suggest that spirit refers to the spiritedness with which our worship is expressed. That can't be time up already. If you need to take the Lord's Supper, that's ready in 105, I believe, down the hall. the spiritedness with which worship is expressed, the excitement. That was a spirited hour together. Dividend points out, I think appropriately, that understanding of that is foreign to the text in the Bible and foreign to other New Testament teaching. That excitement aspect of spiritedness. Now, does that mean it's wrong to be excited? No. But that's not, I think, what he's saying here. Worship in spirit refers to the spiritual communion which takes place when our spirit, our inner being, joins with God, who is spirit. And you can see that reference from 1 Corinthians 2:11 about the spirit of a man, the inner being, if you will. It transcends the physical. We worship in the spiritual realm. Now, granted, we worship in this room. But the worship is, you can't even see it, that spiritual connection, our inner being in fellowship with God's Spirit, I think is what's referred to here. And then the truth may refer to God-authorized acts revealed in Scripture. Certainly the acts must be scriptural. Think Nadab and Abihu. They learned a valuable lesson, didn't they? When they offered strange fire or unauthorized fire, they did something that God didn't tell them to do. Strange fire. But it may mean that worship must be truthful, genuine, not counterfeit. Truth. Worship is vain that does not come from a sincere heart. Oh, well, that's Matthew 15:8 and 9 right there. Jesus said, in vain do they worship me. People who were honoring him with their lips, but he said their heart is far from me. So word worship just doesn't cut it. It doesn't please God. Just saying something doesn't please God. I like to pick on kids because I had some, all right? So I'll just pick on them. You probably have never had this experience, but let me just give you a little example. There were times when our two daughters got upset with each other. Can you hardly believe that? And there were times when they needed to apologize to each other. Would you believe there were times when they said they were sorry to each other that they really were not? It happens, right? It's a learning process. Now I could say, say you're sorry to your sister. I'm sorry. Were they really? We had to have a little more talk. You know what it means if you're really sorry? You don't plan to do that again. It changes inside you. That's not always what comes out of the mouth, is it? Worship must be genuine, sincere. Okay. Well, we're about to run out of time. Let me share another statement from Jivanan, and I think I have, well, that's a little ahead of me, so let me back up. No, it's not. See why I need notes? There you go. I do want that note. Isaiah 1, and you probably can't read that very easily, but if you want to study about empty worship or vain worship, I would really encourage you to take a dive into Isaiah chapter 1. You know, one thing they practiced in the Old Testament about worship was the sacrifices and the bulls and the goats and all of that. Aren't you glad we don't have to do that stuff today? But just read these verses or share these with you. The prophet writes to the people of God, "To what purpose is the multitude of your sacrifices to me, says the Lord? I have had enough of burnt offerings of rams and the fat of fed cattle. I do not delight in the blood of bulls or of lambs or goats. When you come to appear before me, who has required this from your hand, to trample my courts?" Now you can find the naysayers there say, you required it. You're the one that told us to do this. Not like they were doing it. Bring no more futile sacrifices. Incense is an abomination, the new moons, the Sabbaths, the calling of assemblies. I cannot endure iniquity and the sacred meeting. Your new moons and your appointed feast my soul hates. They are a trouble to me. This is God talking to his people who are doing things that he told them to do. I am weary of bearing them. When you spread out your hands, I will hide my eyes from you. Even though you make many prayers, I will not hear. Your hands are full of blood. We could go on. I encourage you to look more in that chapter. But they were doing acts of worship, but they were as empty as they could be. They were sinful, rebellious people going through the motions. Empty worship. Meaningless worship. We must not do the same. So now let's, a statement from Jivaden about this spirit and truth. Perhaps the best understanding in his words. Spirit means in the realm of the spirit. In worship, the spirit of a person comes into fellowship with God, the Spirit. Truth involves the right acts and forms, but focus likely goes a bit further, involving truthfulness, sincerity, genuineness of the inner person, spiritual integrity of an honest heart. And we've referred to Matthew 15 already. He says, God does not accept worship unless it comes from the sincere inner spirit of a person. No matter how beautiful the words, no matter how expensive the offering, no matter how elaborate the surroundings, it's far more than just what we do. It is what we do, but it's got to be genuine. Spirit and in truth. David makes a concise, I think, similar point in Psalm 51, verse 16 and 17. For you do not desire sacrifice, or else I would give it. You do not delight in burnt offering. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and a contrite heart. These, O God, you will not despise. It's the heart of the matter, isn't it? It's the internal, the spirit of man in fellowship with God's Spirit. That's central to worship. But doing things right as well. Both united together is how we can worship in a way that pleases God. Now, we probably just have about 2 minutes left, and I've got probably 3 or 4 questions I could give you. I will give you. Well, I just dropped that. I don't need it again for right now. Can you think of any concerns, any lessons we need to learn today because of these kinds of things we've talked about as we consider worship in our assemblies?
I think we have to practice worship.
We have to.
Lifetime. You become a Christian. You work at it.
Okay.
When you're young, you don't learn, and you study, and you pray, and you have that strong faith.
Okay.
And it's a constant. Even my 7 years old, I'm still working. And it's still hard for me sometimes.
All right.
But your mind,
It's easy to get distracted. It's easy to get distracted. I think you pointed that out last week, didn't you? Things that interfere with worship, and distraction can do it. All right. Excellent. Yes, Lynn?
Justin made a comment in one of his lessons recently that you start preparing for worship on Monday, not Saturday night.
Okay. Good. 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 How we live our lives day by day prepares us for that worship. Good. Anything else? Do you think the religious world gets worship totally right?
Of course not.
Do you think we do in the churches of Christ? Get it totally right?
No.
No, there's room for growth, as you pointed out. Do you think I or you do every time we come in and worship? We've got room to grow, don't we? And I hope and pray that we can grow from this study, that we can improve our worship. My guess is we kind of have the acts figured out. But the genuineness, the undistractedness, if you will, the things that get in the way, that cloud our thinking, we have to bring, what did Paul say in another place about bringing every thought into captivity? That's a bigger challenge, isn't it? That's a bigger challenge. Be genuine and sincere. Okay, any other thoughts? I bet that bell's getting ready to ring, but if you got some time, I had a few more things I was going to say, but I don't think I have time to say them. I'll save that for another class. Well, there you go. All right, God bless you. Next week, Lord willing, Randy will have the lesson, and we'll continue on this study.